I opened the letter from the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association and felt my blood pressure spike before I even finished the first sentence. They were demanding $3,000 in unpaid amenity fees for use of what they called community recreational facilities on property that I knew for a fact belonged to me. Not the HOA. Me. My name was Blake Jennings, and I had just inherited 15 acres of prime land in Bend, Oregon from my grandfather 6 months ago, complete with a small pond, a hiking trail, and a picnic area that had been in my family for 3 generations. The letter was signed by Patricia Murphy, the HOA president, in looping cursive that somehow managed to look condescending even on paper. According to her calculations, I owed fees dating back 2 years, which was impossible because I had only owned the property for half a year. I read through the document 3 times, each pass making me angrier than the last. They claimed that because residents had been using the pond and trails for recreation, I was required to pay maintenance fees to the association for upkeep of these shared amenities. The problem was simple. These weren't shared amenities. They were mine, private property. My grandfather had never joined the HOA when it formed 15 years ago because his land predated the development by decades. He had been grandfathered in, exempt from all HOA rules and regulations. I had the original deed, the survey maps, and a letter from a lawyer confirming this exact fact when I inherited the property. I grabbed my phone and called the number listed on the letterhead. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sugary sweet in a way that immediately set my teeth on edge. Riverside Meadows HOA, this is Brenda speaking. How may I assist you today? I need to speak with Patricia Murphy, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering underneath. May I ask what this is regarding? She sent me a bill for $3,000 that I don't owe. I need to straighten this out immediately. There was a pause, some clicking on a keyboard. Name, please, Blake Jennings. The property on Cascade View Road. Oh yes, Mr. Jennings. Patricia has been trying to reach you. Let me transfer you to her office. The hold music was interrupted after about 30 seconds. Mr. Jennings, this is Patricia Murphy. I am glad you finally decided to contact us about this matter. Miss Murphy, I am calling because you sent me a bill for property amenities that you have no legal right to charge me for. My land is not part of your HOA. Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. Mr. Jennings, I understand this may come as a surprise, but community members have been using your pond and trails for years. Your grandfather never objected. Now that these have become established community amenities, you are responsible for contributing to their maintenance. That is not how property law works, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. My grandfather allowed people to use the land out of kindness. That does not give you the right to charge me fees or claim any ownership. The HOA board has determined that adverse possession principles apply here. The community has maintained open and notorious use of these facilities for over 15 years. We have photos, we have records of trail maintenance we have performed, and we have testimony from dozens of residents. Whether you like it or not, Mr. Jennings, you are obligated to pay these fees. I felt heat rising up my neck. Adverse possession requires exclusive possession and the intent to claim ownership. Your residents were guests on my grandfather's property. That is completely different. I suggest you consult with a lawyer, Mr. Jennings. You will find that the law is on our side. The board meeting is next Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the community center. I expect to see you there with a check for the full amount, or we will be forced to place a lien on your property. She hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone in disbelief, then immediately started searching for property lawyers in Bend. This was insane. I had documentation proving my ownership. They could not just decide my private property was now their community amenity and start billing me for it. I found a lawyer named Robert Chen who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. His office could see me the next morning. I spent the rest of the evening digging through the boxes of documents my grandfather had left me, pulling out every deed, survey, and piece of paper that mentioned the land. There was a hand-drawn map from 1947 showing the original property boundaries. There were tax records going back 60 years. There was even a letter from 2010, where my grandfather politely declined to join the newly formed HOA, stating that his property was separate, and he wished to keep it that way. The HOA had responded with a brief acknowledgement, thanking him for his time and wishing him well. Nothing in that exchange suggested they had any claim to his land or the right to charge any fees. So where had they gotten this idea? I barely slept that night. The audacity of the whole situation kept running through my mind. Patricia Murphy's confident tone, her casual mention of placing a lien on my property, the way she had dismissed my objections as if I was a child who did not understand how things worked. I owned that land free and clear. The mortgage was paid off. The taxes were current. Everything was legitimate and legal. They had no right to demand anything from me. Robert Chen's office was in a renovated house near downtown Bend. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his late 30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I spread all my documents across his conference table and explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "You have the letter they sent?" he asked when I finished. I handed it to him. He read it carefully, his expression growing more incredulous with each line. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "They are threatening to place a lien based on what they claim is adverse possession, but they fundamentally misunderstand the legal standard. Adverse possession requires hostile possession, meaning the possessor must be occupying the land against the interests of the true owner. Permissive use, which is what your grandfather allowed, completely defeats an adverse possession claim." "That is what I thought," I said, relief flooding through me. "So they have no case, not even close. But the fact that they are threatening a lien is concerning. They either have very bad legal advice or they are hoping you will not fight back and just pay the money." He tapped the letter thoughtfully. "The other issue is that they claim to have performed maintenance on your property. Did they?" I shook my head. "I have been walking those trails regularly since I moved here. The only maintenance I have seen is what I have done myself. Some brush clearing, fixing a few erosion spots. Nothing that would suggest an outside organization was doing work." "Good. Do you have photos of the property?" "Tons. I have been documenting everything since I inherited it. Wildlife photos, condition of the trails, the pond. I am out there almost every day." Robert nodded approvingly. "That is going to help. Here is what I recommend. First, I am going to draft a cease and desist letter making it clear that they have no legal right to your property, no right to charge you fees, and no right to threaten liens. Second, I want you to post no trespassing signs around the perimeter of your property. Not because we are trying to keep people out necessarily, but to establish clear boundaries and make it explicit that any use of your land is at your discretion, not theirs." "Will that make me look bad to the neighbors?" I asked. I had been friendly with the few people I had met in the area. I did not want to seem like I was trying to close off land people enjoyed. "We can add signs that say access is permitted during daylight hours or something similar. The point is to establish that you are the owner and you control access. That defeats any future adverse possession claims entirely." "Okay. What about this board meeting she mentioned? Attend it. Bring a copy of my letter. Be polite but firm. Do not let them bully you into agreeing to anything. If they continue to push, we will escalate to court, but hopefully it will not come to that. I left his office feeling much better. Robert sent me a draft of the cease and desist letter that afternoon, and after a few minor revisions, he sent it via certified mail to Patricia Murphy and the HOA board. I ordered professional no trespassing signs online with custom text that read, "Private property. Daytime access permitted. No motorized vehicles." They arrived 3 days later, and I spent a Saturday morning installing them at every access point to my land. That was when I started noticing the cars. A silver Lexus SUV with HOA board member plates parked on the road near my property line, the driver taking photos of my new signs. A woman I did not recognize walking the trails with a clipboard, making notes. When I approached her and asked what she was doing, she claimed she was doing a bird survey for the community. I told her she was on private property and needed to leave. She gave me a withering look, but complied. The more I paid attention, the more I realized the HOA had been treating my land like their own for years. There was a worn spot near the pond where people clearly set up picnic blankets. Someone had hung a rope swing from one of the oak trees without asking permission. There were trash cans that I had not put there, stamped with the HOA logo. They had literally installed their own infrastructure on my property. I documented everything with photos and videos, sending them to Robert. He was as amazed as I was. "This is actually going to strengthen your case," he told me over the phone. "They have been operating under the assumption that they own or control this land. When we demonstrate that they do not, and that they have been trespassing and installing items without permission, it becomes very clear who is in the wrong here." Tuesday arrived. The board meeting was at the community center, a modern building near the entrance of the Riverside Meadows development. I arrived at 6:50, giving myself time to find parking and locate the meeting room. The space was set up like a small auditorium, with rows of chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. Patricia Murphy was in the center, flanked by 4 other people, 2 men and 2 women. Name placards identified them as Harold Green, Linda Vasquez, Thomas Kent, and Deborah Marsh. About 30 residents were scattered throughout the chairs. Most were chatting quietly, but conversation died down when I walked in. I felt eyes on me as I took a seat in the 3rd row. A few people whispered to their neighbors. Apparently word had gotten around about the dispute. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. She had the kind of voice that carried authority despite being slightly nasal. Her blonde hair was cut in a severe bob, and she wore a navy blazer that looked expensive. She was probably in her early 50s, with the kind of polished appearance that came from having both money and time to maintain it. "Before we begin with regular business," she announced, "we need to address an ongoing situation with a property owner who is attempting to restrict community access to established amenities." I felt my jaw clench. She was making me the villain before I even had a chance to speak. Mr. Blake Jennings recently inherited property adjacent to our community. For over 15 years, residents have enjoyed access to a pond and trail system on this property. Mr. Jennings has now posted no trespassing signs and is refusing to pay his share of maintenance fees for these community amenities. I have invited him to tonight's meeting to discuss this matter. "Mr. Jennings, would you like to address the board?" Every head in the room turned toward me. I stood, keeping my expression neutral, and walked to the front of the room. I had Robert's letter in a folder, along with copies for each board member. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak," I said, my voice steady. I want to be very clear about the facts of this situation. The property in question is mine. It has been in my family since 1947. It is not, and has never been, part of the Riverside Meadows HOA. My grandfather allowed residents to use the trails and pond out of neighborly kindness, but that was always permissive use on private property. I handed out copies of Robert's letter to each board member. Patricia's expression soured as she scanned the first page. "This is a cease and desist letter from my attorney," I continued. "It outlines the legal facts of the situation. You have no ownership claim to my property. You have no right to charge me fees. You have no right to threaten liens. The adverse possession claim you mentioned is legally baseless because my grandfather explicitly permitted your use of the land, which defeats the hostile possession requirement. The community has a right to these amenities," Patricia interrupted, her voice sharp. "We have invested time and money into maintaining those trails. Then you did so without my permission or my grandfather's," I said. "I have copies of every piece of correspondence between my grandfather and this HOA. At no point did he agree to any maintenance arrangement or any shared use agreement. You installed trash cans on my property without permission. You encouraged residents to treat private land as if it were public. That was your choice, not mine, and it does not create any legal obligation on my part." "This is outrageous," Linda Vasquez said from the table. "People have been using those trails for their daily walks. You are going to just kick them out." "I am not kicking anyone out," I replied, keeping my tone even. "My signs explicitly state that daytime access is permitted. What I am not going to do is pay you $3,000 in fees for property you do not own and have no right to charge me for." "The board determined that the fees are fair compensation for community maintenance," Thomas Kent said. He was a heavy-set man with a red face that suggested high blood pressure or anger, possibly both. "We have records of expenses related to that property." "Then you should have asked permission before spending that money," I said. "I am not responsible for expenses you chose to incur on someone else's property without consent." The room erupted into conversation. Some people were clearly angry, others confused. An elderly man in the front row stood up. "I've been walking those trails for 10 years, he said. "Are you saying we are trespassing now?" "No, sir," I said, turning to address him directly. "As I said, daytime access is permitted. You are welcome to continue enjoying the property as you always have. What I am saying is that the HOA cannot charge me fees for land they do not own." Patricia banged a gavel on the table. "This is not up for debate, Mr. Jennings. The board has made its decision. You will pay the fees or face legal consequences. Then I look forward to seeing you in court," I said calmly. "Because I have consulted with an attorney who specializes in property law, and he assures me that your position has no legal merit whatsoever. If you attempt to place a lien on my property, I will pursue legal action against the HOA and potentially against individual board members for harassment and attempted fraud." That last part got their attention. Deborah Marsh, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Fraud is a serious accusation, and falsely claiming ownership rights to property you do not own in order to extract money from the rightful owner is potentially fraudulent behavior," I replied. "I am not making threats. I am stating facts. If you back off this baseless claim, we can all move on. If you continue to push it, I will defend my property rights through whatever legal means necessary." Patricia's face had gone red. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, banging the gavel again. "Board members, we will discuss this in executive session." I returned to my seat and gathered my things. As I headed for the exit, several residents stopped me. Most were supportive, saying they had no idea the HOA was trying to charge me for land they did not own. A few were hostile, accusing me of being selfish and ruining the community. I tried to be polite to everyone, reiterating that I was not closing the land, just establishing proper boundaries. As I reached my truck in the parking lot, Patricia appeared beside me. Up close, I could see the anger radiating off her in waves. "You are making a big mistake," she said, her voice low and threatening. "This community takes care of its own. You are not part of it and you never will be." "I am perfectly fine with that," I said, unlocking my door. "I just want to be left alone on my own property." "You think you have won because you have some lawyer, but we have resources too, and we have every resident in this development on our side. Then you should have no problem leaving me and my property alone." I got in my truck and drove away, watching her shrink in my rearview mirror. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. The confrontation had been more intense than I expected, and Patricia's parting words felt less like a warning and more like a threat. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was from the county, stating that there had been a complaint about unpermitted structures on my property and that an inspector would be coming out within the week. I called Robert immediately. "They are retaliating," he said after I read him the notice. "This is a common tactic with aggressive HOAs. They cannot win on the merits, so they try to make your life difficult in other ways. What structures is the notice referring to?" "I have no idea. The only thing on my property is the house, which has been here since 1952, and a small storage shed my grandfather built in the 80s. Both of those would be grandfathered in. Let the inspector come. Be cooperative. Show them all your documentation. Chances are they will find nothing wrong, and then you will have evidence of harassment to add to our case." The inspector arrived 3 days later. His name was Mike Hartley, a tired-looking man in his 50s who seemed annoyed at having to be there. I showed him around the property, pointing out the house and the shed. He took photos and measurements, checked the property boundaries against his county maps, and made notes on a tablet. "Someone reported that you had built a commercial picnic area without permits," he said, looking puzzled. "Do you run any kind of business here?" "No. There are some spots where people like to have picnics, but that is just open land. I have not built anything," he nodded. "Yeah, I do not see anything that would require a permit." The complaint also mentioned unpermitted trail construction, but these trails look like they have been here for decades. "They have. My grandfather made them in the 70s. Mike shook his head. "This is clearly a nuisance complaint. I will file my report stating no violations found." "Sorry you had to deal with this." "You know who filed the complaint?" It came through the HOA. "Patricia Murphy signed it." He gave me a sympathetic look. "Word of advice, document everything. I have seen these HOA disputes get ugly. Cover yourself." I thanked him and watched him drive away. Robert was pleased when I updated him, but also concerned. The good news is the inspection turned up nothing. The bad news is they are escalating. Be prepared for more of this. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more county notices. One claimed I was operating an unpermitted recreational facility. Another said there were environmental violations related to the pond. A third alleged that I was causing traffic issues by allowing public access to private property. Each time, inspectors came out, found nothing wrong, and left. Each time, the complaints were traced back to Patricia Murphy or other HOA board members. I started keeping a detailed log of every incident. The dates, the complaints, the inspector's findings, everything. Robert said it would be useful if we ended up in court. Then things took a darker turn. I came home one afternoon to find that someone had spray-painted "selfish" in large red letters across my fence. The next day, my mailbox was knocked over. The day after that, nails were scattered across my driveway. I called the Bend Police Department and filed reports, but without witnesses or cameras, there was not much they could do. "You should install security cameras," the officer who took my report said. "I cannot say for sure this is related to your HOA dispute, but the timing is suspicious." I ordered a comprehensive camera system that night. Professional installation happened 2 days later. 8 cameras covering every angle of my property, with motion detection and night vision. The technician who installed them mentioned that he had done similar jobs for other people in HOA disputes. "It is crazy how nasty these things get," he said, running cable through my attic. "I installed cameras for a guy whose HOA tried to say his house color was not approved. They kept filing complaints until he had to repaint. Then they said the new color was not right either. Cost him thousands before he finally sued them. Did he win? Yeah, but it took 2 years and a lot of stress." These HOA boards get a little bit of power, and they think they are king of the world. The cameras proved their worth almost immediately. 2 nights after installation, they caught a figure approaching my property around 2 a.m. The person was wearing dark clothes and a hood, but the infrared footage was clear enough to see them carrying a can of spray paint. They were heading toward my fence when my new motion-activated floodlights kicked on. The figure froze, then ran back to a car parked down the road. The license plate was visible for just a moment, but it was enough. I downloaded the footage and called the police first thing in the morning. The officer who responded watched the video several times. "That plate comes back to a Linda Vasquez," he said. "You know her. She is on the HOA board that has been harassing me." The officer's expression hardened. "That changes things. This is not random vandalism. This is targeted harassment related to an ongoing dispute. I am going to follow up on this." 2 days later, Linda Vasquez was charged with attempted criminal mischief. She claimed she was just checking on the property because there had been reports of trespassing. But the spray paint can in her car and the video footage told a different story. Robert immediately filed for a restraining order against her on my behalf, which was granted. The HOA went quiet for about a week after that. I thought maybe they had finally realized they were in the wrong and were backing off. I should have known better. I was checking my mail when a process server approached me. I had been served before, so I knew what was coming. Sure enough, he handed me a thick envelope containing a lawsuit. The Riverside Meadows HOA was suing me for 3 counts: breach of implied contract, unjust enrichment, and intentional interference with community use of property. I called Robert immediately. "They actually filed. I will have the complaint by end of day," he said. He sounded more excited than worried. "This is good in a way. It forces the issue into court where we can definitively settle it. And honestly, their claims are so weak that I would not be surprised if the judge sanctions them for filing a frivolous lawsuit." "How long will this take?" "Could be months. HOA cases usually move faster than some civil suits because courts recognize they affect people's homes. I would estimate 6 to 9 months before we get a ruling, assuming it does not settle earlier." "What are the chances they will settle?" "Once they see how bad their position is, pretty good. But people like Patricia Murphy do not like to admit they are wrong. She might push this all the way to trial just on principle." The lawsuit changed the dynamic in the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, and suddenly, I was the center of attention. Some neighbors were supportive, bringing me casseroles and offering testimony about how the HOA had always overreached. Others were hostile, leaving nasty notes in my mailbox or glaring at me when we crossed paths. The community was dividing over the issue, and I was stuck in the middle of it. My lawyer filed a response to the lawsuit that was brutal in its efficiency. He systematically demolished every claim the HOA made, citing case law and Oregon property statutes. He also filed a counterclaim for harassment, trespass, and abuse of process. Additionally, he subpoenaed all HOA financial records related to my property, demanding proof of any maintenance expenses they claimed to have incurred. That subpoena was apparently the straw that broke Patricia Murphy's composure. She called me directly, her voice shaking with rage. "You have no right to our financial records," she said. "Those are private HOA business." "You made them my business when you sued me claiming you spent money on my property," I replied calmly. "Discovery works both ways, Patricia. If you are going to claim unjust enrichment, you need to prove you actually spent the money you say you did. This is harassment. I am going to report you to the Bar Association. I am not a lawyer, so that threat does not make much sense, but feel free to report Robert Chen. I am sure the Bar Association will be very interested to hear about an HOA board that has been filing false county complaints, vandalizing property, and pursuing frivolous lawsuits." She hung up on me. Again, the discovery process was revealing. When the HOA finally produced their financial records under court order, it turned out they had documented almost no expenses related to my property. There were a few $100s over 15 years for things like trash bags for the cans they had installed without permission, but nothing remotely close to the $3,000 they were demanding. Moreover, Robert found evidence that the HOA had been collecting a special assessment from residents specifically for trail maintenance for the past 5 years, totaling over $40,000 from the community. "This is fraud," Robert said when he showed me the documents. "They have been collecting money from residents for maintaining your property, which they do not own and have no responsibility for. Then they tried to collect additional money from you. They essentially charged for the same service twice, once to you and once to the residents." "Can we use that in the case?" "Absolutely. This goes from a property dispute to potential fraud and embezzlement. I'm going to file an amended counterclaim, and I am also going to refer this to the district attorney's office. This is not just a civil matter anymore." Things moved quickly after that. The district attorney assigned an investigator to look into the HOA's finances. Residents started asking questions about where their special assessment money had gone. Several homeowners filed their own complaints with the state, questioning the HOA's financial management. Patricia Murphy called an emergency board meeting, which residents demanded be open to the public. Over 100 people showed up, filling the community center beyond capacity. I attended with Robert, sitting in the back and watching the chaos unfold. Homeowner after homeowner stood up demanding answers. Where had the $40,000 gone? Why was the HOA suing a property owner for land they did not control? Why had board members been filing false complaints with the county? The board had no good answers. Patricia tried to maintain control, insisting that everything they had done was in the community's best interest, but her authority was crumbling in real time. "You told us that money was going to maintain the trails," one woman shouted, "but the trails are not even on HOA property. You lied to us." "It was an arrangement we believed we had," Patricia said, her face flushed. "The previous property owner allowed access, and we assumed that created certain obligations. You cannot assume your way into owning someone else's land," a man called out. "That is not how property rights work." The meeting devolved into arguments and accusations. Thomas Kent resigned from the board on the spot, saying he had not been aware of the financial irregularities and wanted no part of it. Deborah Marsh followed suit 10 minutes later. By the end of the night, Patricia Murphy, Linda Vasquez, and Harold Green were the only board members left, and they were facing a recall petition signed by over 60% of the homeowners. 2 weeks later, the district attorney filed criminal charges. Patricia Murphy was charged with fraud and embezzlement for the misappropriation of HOA funds. Linda Vasquez faced additional charges related to the vandalism attempt caught on my cameras. Harold Green was charged as an accessory for helping conceal the financial irregularities. The civil lawsuit collapsed shortly after the criminal charges were filed. The HOA's lawyer withdrew from the case, citing ethical concerns about continuing to represent clients facing criminal charges related to the same underlying conduct. The remaining board members voted to drop the lawsuit against me and to formally acknowledge that they had no claim to my property. They also issued a public apology, though it was clearly written by lawyers and lacked any real contrition. The recall election happened in early March. Patricia Murphy, Linda Vasquez, and Harold Green were all removed from the board. A new slate of members was elected, people who ran on platforms of transparency and fiscal responsibility. One of their first acts was to vote to dissolve the Trail Maintenance Special Assessment and refund any unused funds to homeowners. The criminal case took longer to resolve. Patricia Murphy tried to fight the charges, insisting she had acted in good faith and that any financial issues were mistakes, not crimes. The evidence told a different story. Investigators found that she had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as maintenance costs. The trail maintenance assessment had been largely a slush fund that she and the other board members had dipped into for everything from personal dinners to vacation expenses. Linda Vasquez pleaded guilty to attempted vandalism and received probation plus community service. Harold Green took a plea deal as well, cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Patricia Murphy held out until the week before trial, then accepted a plea agreement. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to me for legal expenses. I watched her sentencing from the gallery. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the reality of her situation. The judge was harsh in his comments, noting that positions of community trust came with responsibilities, and that she had betrayed both her neighbors and the legal system with her actions. "You used your position to harass a property owner who was asserting his legal rights," the judge said. "You filed false complaints, you misappropriated funds, you encouraged vandalism, and when challenged, you doubled down rather than admitting your mistakes. This court takes such abuses of power seriously." As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had won, completely and decisively. My property rights were secure. The HOA had been held accountable. Justice had been served. But the whole ordeal had taken nearly a year of my life and cost me tens of thousands in legal fees, even though I eventually recovered most of it through the judgment. It had divided a community and sent people to jail, all because one person with a little bit of authority had decided she knew better than the law. Robert walked out with me. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Exhausted," I admitted. "Glad it is over. You did the right thing. If you had backed down, they would have kept pushing. People like Patricia Murphy only stop when they are forced to face consequences." I nodded. He was right, but that did not make the experience any less draining. The new HOA board reached out to me a few weeks after the sentencing. They wanted to establish a formal agreement regarding access to my property, something in writing that would clarify the rights and responsibilities of both parties. Robert helped me draft a simple agreement that stated the land remained my private property, that I was granting permissive access during daylight hours for passive recreation, and that the HOA had no maintenance obligations or financial responsibilities related to the property. It also included a clause stating that I could revoke access at any time for any reason. The board signed it immediately and thanked me for my willingness to continue sharing the space with residents. It was the kind of arrangement that should have existed from the beginning, if anyone had bothered to do things properly. Life slowly returned to normal after that. I continued maintaining the trails and keeping the property in good shape, not because I had to, but because I enjoyed it. Residents still walked the paths and fished in the pond, though the number of people dropped significantly after all the drama. Those who did come by were generally respectful, often stopping to thank me for allowing access. I ran into Thomas Kent one afternoon while I was clearing some brush near the main trail. He had been the first board member to resign when things started falling apart, and he looked genuinely remorseful. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I went along with Patricia's schemes without asking enough questions. I should have pushed back when she started talking about charging you fees. I knew your grandfather, and I knew he never agreed to any of that." "Why did you not say anything?" I asked. He sighed heavily. "Honestly, I did not want the conflict. Patricia was so certain she was right, and she had a way of steamrolling anyone who disagreed with her. It is a weak excuse, I know. I should have stood up for what was right." "Well, you did resign when you found out about the financial fraud," I said. "That is something. Small comfort. I helped create the environment where she could get away with what she did." He paused, then added, "For what it is worth, the new board is completely different. They are focused on actual community needs, not power trips. Things are better now." I believed him. The few interactions I had with the new board members had been professional and respectful. They seemed to understand that their authority extended to HOA property and common areas, not to private land that happened to be nearby. Over the following months, I started to feel more connected to the community, ironically enough. Without the constant conflict and harassment, I could actually get to know my neighbors as people rather than as adversaries. I learned that most of them had been uncomfortable with Patricia's tactics, but had felt powerless to stop her. HOA boards operated with surprising autonomy, and challenging them required organizing and effort that many people did not have time or energy for. Several residents told me that my fight had inspired them to pay more attention to HOA governance. Attendance at board meetings increased dramatically. Financial reports were scrutinized. Proposed rules were debated rather than rubber-stamped. The community became more engaged and more democratic, all because people had seen what could happen when a board went unchecked. I also made peace with the financial cost of the whole ordeal. Yes, I had spent a significant amount on legal fees, even with reimbursement. Yes, it had been stressful and time-consuming, but I had protected something important, not just for myself but as a matter of principle. Property rights matter. The rule of law matters. Standing up to bullies matters. If I had simply paid the $3,000 Patricia demanded, it would have set a precedent that would have led to more demands, more overreach, more abuse. By the time summer arrived, more than a year after I first received that ridiculous letter from the HOA, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The property was peaceful. The legal battles were over. The community was healing. I spent my days working remotely from my grandfather's house, taking breaks to walk the trails or sit by the pond. It was the life my grandfather had envisioned for this place, a quiet refuge where people could enjoy nature without all the complications of modern bureaucracy. One evening in late July, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking slightly nervous. They introduced themselves as Mark and Jennifer, new residents who had just moved into the neighborhood. "We wanted to thank you for keeping the trails open," Jennifer said. "We have a 2-year-old daughter and she loves walking down to see the ducks at the pond. It is really special to have access to this kind of space." "You are welcome," I said. "Just respect the land and we will all be fine." "We heard about what happened with the old HOA board," Mark added. "Just wanted you to know that not everyone supported that. We think what you did was right." After they left, I sat there thinking about how strange the whole journey had been. I had inherited property expecting a simple transition, a peaceful place to live and work. Instead, I had been dragged into a legal battle that exposed corruption, divided a community, and sent people to jail. But in the end, the system had worked. The law had protected the rightful property owner. The criminals had faced consequences. Justice, slow and imperfect as it often was, had prevailed. I thought about Patricia Murphy in county jail, about Linda Vasquez doing community service, about Harold Green trying to rebuild his reputation. Part of me felt sorry for them. They had destroyed their own lives over something so unnecessary, so completely avoidable. If Patricia had simply accepted that she did not have the authority she thought she did, none of this would have happened. If she had approached me respectfully instead of with demands and threats, we could have worked out an agreement that satisfied everyone. But that required humility and flexibility, qualities she apparently lacked. She had been so convinced of her own righteousness, so certain that her position gave her power, that she could not see reality even when it was documented in legal filings and property deeds. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when people confuse authority with wisdom, when they let ego override law. The new HOA sent out a newsletter in August detailing their financial reforms and transparency initiatives. They had hired a professional management company to handle the books, implemented quarterly audits, and created a system where any expenditure over $500 required a vote of the full membership. They had also established clear policies about what the HOA could and could not regulate, explicitly acknowledging that private property outside the development was not subject to HOA oversight. It was everything the organization should have been from the beginning. And while I wished it had not taken a criminal case to get there, I was glad to see the community moving in a healthier direction. I kept my security cameras running, just in case, but they mostly captured deer, raccoons, and the occasional lost hiker. The footage of Linda Vasquez approaching with spray paint was saved in multiple locations as a reminder of how bad things had gotten and how important it was to document everything. Robert had been right about that from the beginning. Without the cameras, without the detailed records, without the paper trail, it would have been much harder to prove what was happening. Autumn brought tourists to Bend, people drawn by the changing leaves and mild weather. Some of them found their way to my trails, following paths that led from the main development. I did not mind. The land was meant to be enjoyed. I just made sure there were signs clearly marking it as private property with permissive access, so there could be no confusion about ownership. One afternoon, I encountered a group of college students having a picnic near the pond. They were respectful, had brought their own trash bags, and were clearly just enjoying the space. We chatted for a few minutes, and they mentioned they had read about the HOA case online. "That story went kind of viral in property law circles," one of them said. Our professor used it as an example of HOA overreach in class. You are like famous in legal education now. I laughed at that. Not exactly the kind of fame I was looking for. Still, you stood up for your rights. That is cool. After they left, I looked up the case online out of curiosity. Sure enough, there were articles in legal journals, discussions on property law forums, even a few YouTube videos analyzing what had happened. The consensus seemed to be that it was a clear-cut case of an HOA vastly overstepping its authority and facing appropriate consequences. Some commenters speculated about what would have happened if I had not fought back, if I had just paid the initial $3,000 demand. The general agreement was that Patricia would have continued escalating her claims until she effectively controlled the property. That thought made me grateful once again that I had stood my ground. It would have been easier in the short term to just pay and move on. But it would have been wrong, both legally and morally. Sometimes the easy path is not the right path. Winter arrived with snow that blanketed the property in white silence. The trails became cross-country skiing paths. The pond froze over, and I put up signs warning against ice skating because I had not tested the ice thickness and did not want liability issues. A few residents asked if I would be willing to test it and allow skating if it was safe. I politely declined. There were limits to how much access and risk I was willing to provide, and that was beyond my comfort zone. The new board respected my decision without argument. That alone was proof of how much things had changed. The old board would have probably filed some kind of complaint or threatened legal action. The new board simply thanked me for considering the request and moved on. Patricia Murphy was released from jail in January after serving about 11 months of her sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved out of state immediately upon release, unable to face the community she had alienated. Linda Vasquez stayed in the area but kept a low profile. Harold Green tried to resume his normal life, but found that many former friends were not interested in reconciling. I did not take any satisfaction in their struggles. The whole situation had been unfortunate for everyone involved, but I also did not feel guilty. They had made their choices, had doubled down on those choices even when given opportunities to back off, and had faced the legal consequences of their actions. That was how the system was supposed to work. Robert Chen and I stayed in touch. He sent me occasional updates about other HOA cases he was handling, some of which made my situation look tame by comparison. There were stories of HOAs trying to force people to remove solar panels, demanding specific breeds of dogs be removed from properties, even attempting to regulate what colors of cars could be parked in driveways. The creativity of HOA overreach seemed endless. Why do people get like that? I asked him during one phone call, what is it about being on an HOA board that makes people turn into petty tyrants? It is a mix of things, he said thoughtfully. Some people are attracted to HOA boards specifically because they want that power. Others start with good intentions but get caught up in the authority. And HOAs themselves are weird legal entities. They have real power over people's homes, but they are run by volunteers with no training or oversight. It is a recipe for problems. Should there be more regulation of HOAs? Probably, but that is a political question, not a legal one. For now, we work within the system we have. As winter turned to spring and then to summer again, I realized I had been in Bend for over 2 years. The property that had been the source of so much conflict had become my genuine home. I knew every tree, every curve of the trails, every seasonal change in the pond's ecosystem. I had plans to build a small workshop near the house, to plant some native wildflowers along the southern trail, to create a small wildlife observation area near the wetland section. The legal battle felt like ancient history, even though it had only been about a year since the sentencing. Life had moved on. The community had moved on. Even I had moved on, though I had learned lessons I would carry forever about standing up for rights, documenting everything, and never assuming that people in authority are operating in good faith. I was out checking the trails one morning in June when I ran into Deborah Marsh, one of the former board members who had resigned during the emergency meeting. We had never really talked after everything happened, and I could tell she was nervous about the encounter. "I have been meaning to reach out," she said. "I owe you an apology. I did not participate in the worst of what Patricia did, but I knew something was not right and I did not speak up soon enough." "You did resign when the truth came out," I pointed out. "Only because I did not want to be dragged down with them. That is not exactly heroic." She paused, then added, "I learned a lot from watching what happened to you, about the importance of asking questions and not just going along with things because someone in authority says they are right. I teach elementary school, and I have actually incorporated some of those lessons into how I approach administration now." "That is good," I said. "Maybe something positive came out of all this mess after all." We talked for a few more minutes, and I realized I had genuinely forgiven her. She had made mistakes but had not been malicious, just passive and conflict-averse. That was different from Patricia's active fraud and harassment. As she walked away, I reflected on how many people had been affected by this situation. The homeowners who had paid unnecessary fees. The board members who had lost their positions and reputations. The community that had been divided. The legal system that had to process criminal charges. All because one person had decided that her interpretation of property rights mattered more than actual property law. But there were positive effects too. A community that was now more engaged in its own governance. Homeowners who paid attention to HOA finances. A board that operated with transparency. Neighbors who understood the limits of HOA authority. And me with absolute clarity about my property rights and the knowledge that I could defend them if necessary. The summer passed peacefully. Tourists came and went. Residents used the trails. The pond teemed with life. I worked on my projects, both professional and personal. The workshop got built. The wildflowers were planted and began to thrive. The wildlife observation area became a favorite spot for local photographers. In September, the HOA held its annual meeting. I attended as an observer, curious to see how the organization functioned under new leadership. The difference was remarkable. The board presented clear financial reports. They discussed maintenance issues and community concerns. They listened to resident input. They voted on proposals in an open and transparent manner. It was everything an HOA should be, boring in the best possible way. After the meeting, the current board president, a retired engineer named David Thornton, approached me. "We are working on updating the community handbook," he said. "There is a section on neighborhood amenities, and we wanted to make sure we describe your property correctly. Would you mind reviewing the language we have drafted?" He handed me a printout. The section acknowledged that the trails and pond were on private property, credited me by name for allowing community access, and clearly stated that access was a privilege that could be modified or revoked at the owner's discretion. It also thanked my grandfather for his years of generosity in sharing the land. "This is perfect," I said, genuinely touched. It was the kind of acknowledgement that should have existed from the beginning. "We also wanted to ask if you would be willing to speak at a new homeowner orientation we are putting together," David added. "Nothing formal, Just a few minutes about the history of the trails and the importance of respecting private property. We think it would help new residents understand the community better. I agreed, and a few weeks later found myself standing in front of about 20 new homeowners, telling the story of my grandfather's land and the legal battle that had ensued when the old HOA forgot whose property it actually was. I kept it factual and educational, focusing on the lessons rather than the drama. The new residents listened attentively and asked thoughtful questions. One woman raised her hand. What would you say to someone who is facing a similar situation with their HOA? Document everything, I said immediately. Keep records of every interaction, every letter, every complaint. Take photos and videos. Get legal advice early before things escalate. And do not be afraid to stand up for your rights. HOAs have authority, but that authority has limits. When they exceed those limits, they need to be challenged. Another person asked, "Do you regret fighting back? It sounds like it was really stressful." I thought about that for a moment. It was stressful. It was expensive and time-consuming and emotionally draining. But no, I do not regret it. If I had not fought back, I would have been paying unjust fees forever. The corruption would have continued. The community would have kept suffering under bad leadership. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do. The orientation ended with applause, which felt strange and somewhat undeserved. I had just been protecting my own property. But I understood what they were really applauding, the idea that individuals could stand up to institutional overreach and win. That was a message worth celebrating. As autumn settled in again, 3 years after I had first inherited the property, I finally felt like all the turmoil was truly behind me. The legal case was closed. The restitution had been paid. The community had stabilized under better leadership. My property rights were secure and documented beyond any possible dispute. I spent an October afternoon sitting by the pond, watching the leaves drift down from the oak trees. A family of ducks paddled across the water. Somewhere in the woods, a woodpecker hammered at a tree. The air smelled of pine and earth and approaching winter. It was peaceful in a way that I had almost forgotten was possible during the worst of the conflict with Patricia Murphy. My phone buzzed with an email. It was from Robert Chen, checking in and sharing a news article. Another HOA case had made headlines, this one in California, where a board had tried to fine a homeowner for displaying a political sign. The homeowner had sued and won, with the court awarding substantial damages for violation of First Amendment rights. Another HOA learns that having authority does not mean having unlimited authority, Robert wrote. Your case gets cited in these discussions now. You helped establish important precedent. I smiled at that. Maybe some good had come from all the stress after all. If my case helped other property owners defend their rights, if it made HOA boards think twice before overreaching, then the struggle had served a purpose beyond just protecting my own land. As the sun set over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was my home. This was my land. I had fought for it, defended it, and secured it. Not just for myself, but for the principle that property rights matter, that individuals can stand up to institutions, and that the legal system, for all its flaws, generally protects those who are in the right. The trails would continue to wind through the woods. The pond would continue to host ducks and fish and the occasional intrepid kayaker. Neighbors would continue to enjoy the space, now with proper respect and appreciation for the privilege of access. And I would continue to maintain it all, not because anyone forced me to, not because I owed anyone fees, but because it was mine to care for and I chose to share it. That choice, freely made rather than coerced through fraudulent fees and threats, made all the difference. It was the difference between being a property owner and being a victim of institutional overreach. It was the difference between living in a community based on mutual respect and living under the thumb of petty tyrants. It was the difference between justice and injustice. And as darkness fell over Riverside Meadows and the stars began to appear overhead, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice in fighting back, in standing firm, in defending what was rightfully mine against those who thought they could simply take it through intimidation and false legal claims. The property was secure, the community was better, and I could finally, truly rest easy on my own land.